Okay, so we're going to talk about the Romantic era now, and what I want you guys to be thinking about, both as we go through this video and as we talk about Romanticism in class, is how this stuff connects to the political and social happenings in the mid-19th century. How is, this kind of emphasis on emotion over reason in literature, poetry, art, and music, also emphasizing in the ways in which you have liberals and socialists uh, trying to establish, a more egalitarian government over the conservative governments that had been established after the French Revolution. Why is that? So first off, before we get into specific examples, let's think about the characteristics of the Romantic era. Okay, so basically, this is going to kind of accompany the more radical and liberal social and political movements of the 19th century. So we're going to see that it's very much a reactionary movement. So many romantic artists, poets, writers, and so on are writing specifically against some of the changes that have taken place earlier in the 19th century. A lot of them are very much against industrialization, but a lot of them are also anti-enlightenment. They don't like the emphasis on reason, progress. So instead, they are very emotional. Okay, so if you once we go through all these examples, we'll get a sense of what that actually means. Like, how can you be emotional in art or music or writing? In some instances, it may be easier to deduce that than others. But there's actually a German saying that is used by German romantics called Sturm und Drang, or Drang, that is, which means storm and stress. And German romantics in the 1770s and 1780s used this term to kind of convey the emotional intensity that their art was meant to portray. And you're going to see a lot of the examples of art actually are kind of showing the power of nature, and a lot of times the violent power of nature, which I think Sturm und Drang really represents. It's a really good thing to mention if you're writing an essay and you're talking about a particular work of art. Remember that phrase. It's a really good one. So along with that, Romantic art also glorifies nature. It is very much interested in the way that nature can prevail over man, also the way that nature can be very violent or tempestuous. It also is, because it's a reaction against previous eras, it likes to reject rules or restrictions, some of the rationalism that was placed upon art by the previous era of art, which was called classicism, as well as the Enlightenment. So you're going to see, like, for example, if you think about the gardens of Versailles, which are very orderly, versus like I wish I could, you know what, I'll bring a picture into class because I already have this PowerPoint all queued up, but like picture a little bit more of a modern French garden where everything is kind of haphazardly planted, still beautiful, but at the same time not these like trimmed, perfect hedges. I mean, basically, like you can see it as a little bit more random because it wants to throw away a lot of the rules. Also, Romanticism can turn back towards religion. We've seen, of course, during the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment that there was kind of a turn more towards secularism or deism. Actually, a lot of the Romantic thinkers liked the idea that religion was sort of mystical, that it was, it wasn't absolute, it was really difficult to define. Because religion doesn't really follow the rules, they liked that and they liked to incorporate it into their work. They believed that industrialization was dehumanizing, so you're going to see in some romantics art, if they do portray industrialization, they portray it in a negative light for the most part. And also, they're very nostalgic. Okay, so I mean, in a way, we think of nostalgic as, of course, yearning for the past. They see that there was kind of an age of innocence that needs to be enjoyed much more. The idea that life prior to industrialization was much better. We're going to see a lot of works of art in particular that show that, but also just the general idea that childhood in itself is an age of innocence and it should be enjoyed before encountering all the problems of adult life. So again, very much nature oriented, critical of industry, in a way, overall, let's think of it very much as reactionary. It does not like how quickly the world is changing around it, and it is very critical of progress. So let's think of examples. First, in poetry and literature, I actually tend to find this stuff a little bit more boring, and then we'll look at the art and the music. So we'll get this stuff over with first. So in England, we actually are going to, in class, read a little excerpt from Oliver Goldsmith's poem called The Deserted Village. But in general, just as a review here, remember that what Goldsmith is looking at is how negative the depopulation of the countryside is. He's very much sort of lamenting the urbanization that is taking place in England. And we can kind of couple Oliver Goldsmith's poem with the work of John Constable, which we'll talk about later on today. Very much, both of them are very centered around nature, and both of them really want to go back to the time when most people lived in and enjoyed the countryside. We also have William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, also English. All these people in this slide are English, by the way, poets. They were most known for their 1798 lyrical ballads. And the reason why they were romantic, a couple of things. First off, again, they write very much about how nature is kind of this mysterious force that the poet can learn from, but also it is romantic because they are trying to defy all of the rules that previous poetry had followed. Previous poetry was very difficult to read if you were not very well educated. It had very kind of flowery, ornate language. And so what Wordsworth and Coleridge do in their lyrical ballads is they make their poetry easy to read. Also, we're going to look a little bit more closely at Wordsworth's poem Daffodils. It actually was in the Mackay reading, but you also see that this is a work of poetry that is romanticizing nature in particular. A very, very common theme. Let's turn now to a Scottish romantic poet, Sir Walter Scott. Now you could use him as a very good example of this nostalgic element of romanticism because he is very interested in history. Most of his works are very long narrative poems, and he also writes historical novels. And most of his novels actually tell tales of war and chivalry. Two prominent examples of that are Rob Roy here and Ivanhoe. Rob Roy is written in 1817. Ivanhoe was written in 1819. Ivanhoe in particular, it's a story between of a fight between the Saxon and Norman knights in medieval England. And it's very much kind of glorifying that type of warfare, of course, back when chivalry was still very much alive. Remember that once we get closer to the modern era, there isn't the same sort of importance in chivalry and knighthood, because with a permanent standing army, you have, the vast majority of the population is involved, and so you don't have that kind of distinction of that kind of knight class, so to speak. So he's kind of yearning towards going back to that. Lord Byron, probably one of the most flamboyant of all the romantic poets. He's English. One of the reasons why you might see him as flamboyant is because his overall lifestyle could be seen as a little bit risque for the time, but even for now. Historians almost always view him as bisexual. When he was in his 20s, he he bragged a lot about his promiscuity. He had an affair with a 15-year-old boy. He also had numerous affairs with married women. And his book Don Juan, actually it's a poem, my apologies. Don Juan is one of the best portrayals of his lifestyle, but also of romanticism in general. The character Don Juan, you might kind of hear this used in popular culture sometimes. Someone is a Don Juan, someone is kind of, it's a way to describe like a player, I guess you could say now. Don Juan was a character that instead of being seen as a womanizer, he argued that women easily seduced him. His argument was that the kind of sensuality that he experienced was actually coming from women rather than from him. So this was kind of, controversial in a way. But basically, some other themes in his book are, again, nature's cruelty and beauty, But he also, this is one of the ways that some romantics kind of take issue with him, realize that no one romantic kind of fits into like a square. Don Juan is a little bit praising of urban life. And some romantics, of course, criticize him for that because so many of them are kind of anti-industrialization. Lord Byron is also seen as a romantic because of his involvement in the Greek independence movement. He actually joins the independence movement. He fights for the Greeks and he actually dies while fighting the Turks. So he kind of epitomizes romanticism because he actually dies for the cause. We also have a German poet named Frederick von Schiller. He is most well known for writing the poem Ode to Joy, which was later set to music by Beethoven. And again, he is very much interested in nature's ability to kind of free the individual. He argues that people can reach a state of freedom just by observing the beauty of one's surroundings. So again, that's very, I mean, of course we call them romantic because we realize that a lot of their ideas are kind of hard to actually reach. Like obviously freedom requires a lot more than just looking at one's beauty, the beauty of one's surroundings, but still it kind of sounds nice, right? He also believes that freedom is unleashing the senses and the passion of the soul. So maybe the idea that you can achieve freedom without necessarily going through the tangible processes that some of the people who were revolting against the government were going for. It seems as though some of these romantics actually believe that there's kind of a more internal freedom that can be achieved. But maybe I'm reading too much into that. Okay, another German romantic, Goethe, probably the better known. Goethe is one of the most famous German writers overall, not just in the Romantic era, but throughout German literature. His most well-known work, I would argue, is The Sorrows of Young Werther. It very much fits into the romantic idea. It's a series of letters that were written about a man who was in love with a woman, but he can't have her because she was already engaged to be married. And this man, throughout the series of letters, actually gets to know not only the woman, but he gets to know the man. And once he kind of understands this couple, he realizes that he can never have her, and the book ends with his suicide. So, you know, it's this book about romantic love and rejection and the idea that the romantic hero can be very much misunderstood and rejected by society, and it ends in tragedy. And so, you know, this novel is very much influential for other writers who deal with tragic stories. But I mean, ultimately, it does not have this perfect ending, and it even romanticizes this flawed character who cannot have the woman that he desires. This very much goes away from the classical period where normally things tied up kind of neatly in the end. Also, he writes Faust, which you could say kind of criticizes the excesses of romanticism because you may have heard of the Faustian bargain. It means selling one's soul to the devil. People argue that this is kind of a critique of how romanticism may go too far. But nonetheless, Goethe, very significant. I would definitely focus on the sorrows of young Werther because it is such a good example of romanticism. Okay, now let's move on to France with Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo is probably most well known for writing The Hunchback of Notre Dame. You may or may not have, if you haven't read it, you may be familiar with the Disney version, Quasimodo, right? Or at the very least, you're familiar with the idea that the Hunchback is sort of this disfigured, obviously this person who does not fit into the traditional aesthetics, you know, of what human beauty is supposed to be. And the reason why this is romantic is because, well, first off, he's using kind of fantastic characters, he's using strange settings, he is very much kind of going into human emotion because he is trying to portray the perspective of a person that may very well be ignored traditionally in society. And also, he is portraying even the ugly as a form of art. And so, like most romantics, and we'll talk about this even more with the art in the next video, but you see how many of these romantic writers are not necessarily emphasizing perfection or not necessarily emphasizing the ideal. They see progress and the progress that had been accomplished during the Industrial Revolution as something that can have very negative effects. So oftentimes they are yearning for the past, they are yearning for the imperfect, and they are yearning for the emotion. We'll get more to that with art.